Welcome. We're starting our discussion of food additive petitions on part two. Last week, looking at a general overview, what are food additive petitions, what are their general elements, how does the statutory criteria work, and today getting into the specifics, how do we have confidence that the petition we put together meets that threshold for approval, in particular looking at the safety criteria and really narrowing our focus for today. This is probably getting old hat and a little bit tiresome, but I don't want us to develop a habit of jumping into the big juicy issues that get our attention, toxicity, safety, all of these things that can be really tantalizing and jump to, but we want to talk about why are we even under the FDA jurisdiction, why are we in the Center for Tobacco Products or the Center for Veterinary Medicine, why are we with the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. So we're talking about a food. We're confident that the substance and the product we're working with is a food or a component of food. It's an added substance that we're looking at. So we're looking at something that's not naturally occurring. It fits into that food additive amendment definition. All of this is important not only for our analytical approach that we're taking, but also a reminder of why we're doing this. We're doing this not only to get onto the market. This is a barrier to market, but also that if we don't follow this process and we enter the market, the consequences are that our product is adulterated. And that's ultimately the whole system we're working under is a way to avoid adulteration. If we didn't have the food additive amendment, then we would go through this process and the FDA could come back and determine that this is an added component that may render the food product injurious and have a whole system going there. And we talked about that history. And so that's why we're here. We're trying to avoid a finding of adulteration, and we're going through the scheme that the FDA has given us. And we're looking at food additive amendments because we're not having an intended use to impart color. We'll start our discussion next week into the color additive amendment, looking at the approval criteria, the petitioning process, all of that. And it's going to be a really great opportunity to take what we learned today and what we learned last week and do a comparative analysis because they do share so much in common, but they do have stark differences. And also, we're looking at food additive petitions in particular because we're not on the generally recognized as safe category. That gratuitous exemption that we have where you fall under the food additive amendment because you're generally recognized as safe, you're immediately taken out of it. And we talked about the reasons that you could be generally recognized as safe. You're listed, you have a common use as food prior to January 1st, 1958, or there's published studies that showing a consensus among scientists that the substance is safe. You have one of those three bases to provide GROS, and if any of those three fail, then you're here, and you're going through a food additive petition, and you're trying to figure out, is your substance going to gain approval through this process? And we went through this last week. We drafted a petition. We determined that it's complete. The agency tells us that it's complete and it's going to begin a review. It submits a filing notice, lets the public know that it's beginning this review. And here's where we're going to be today. Substantive review, chemistry, toxicology, environmental, and consumer safety. All of those conducting a review and all of those applying a particular approval standard to determine whether or not this food additive petition, this added substance, is safe, is something that it can approve. And we'll go through statutory, CFR, and guidance documents, heavy reliance on guidance documents. But this is where we'll be today, substantive review. We get through that process, we've learned what we can today, and we were able to get through that gateway. All of that compiles into our safety data, our petition, communications, all of this compiles into an administrative record that the FDA compiles, and they issue a final regulation. And when we saw in our discussion last week, we step into the unknown at that point. We don't really have control of the approval process or the approval criteria then. We are subject to comment, hearing, objection, and challenges. And it's a bit of a wild frontier, but we can focus on our substantive review and provide the best support for our petition and then hope for the best. And again, all of this process, this is 24 months of review time, but this isn't necessarily accounting for that time that you may need to conduct toxicity studies, get environmental studies. There can be much more time involved in the 24 months of just FDA review time, but this is a long process. So our focus is on safety, and we saw that with GROS. We see that as an overarching theme, and we're looking at this pre-market clearance. And here we have 3 safety standards that provide a general outline of what our approval criteria is. And then from there, as so often is the case with the FDA, the rest is in guidance documents. And reaching back into our Introduction to Food Law course, remembering that in terms of hierarchy, at the most authoritative end, we have the statute, followed by the Code of Federal Regulations. That's an interpretation of the statute. And then we have guidance documents, which are, just as they say, just guidance. They're FDA thinking on a particular topic. They're not binding, and be very careful about draft guidance. None of what we'll talk about today will be draft guidance, but if you see that out there, make sure that you're giving that the weight that it's due. The 3 safety standards we're looking at come from the CFR, so in that interim, that medium level of authority. We saw this definition before for safe or safety. Here's the full definition that's provided. And again, reasonable certainty that the substance is not harmful, and the key being under the intended conditions for use. And so we have to look at how it's prepared, how it's manufactured, all of these pieces that are coming in, and how it's intended for the consumer to use. And so all of that coming into place to make sure that we have a reasonable certainty that it's not going to be harmful. And that's our general definition for safe or safety in looking at any of the food additive provisions that we're going to be looking at. So that's our general definition. Next, we have our general principles for evaluating safety. That's CFR 170.20. We have our full definition, and then there's a supplemental piece in Part B. But it's what you would imagine. It's not going to be. It's difficult to draft a rule for the FDA that covers the full gamut of what the FDA regulates. We have everything from fish to grains to fresh produce. The FDA has a wide enforcement and pre-market mandate, and so it's difficult to get a very specific definition that will work for your particular substance. So that's why the FDA does these general definitions, specific biological properties. What are we talking about with your particular substance that you have in your petition? And then the main piece to pull from this definition is the adequacy of the methods used to demonstrate safety. We want to make sure we're not doing the most questionable scientific study, but we're actually doing the most rigorous scientific study. It would stand up to peer review. And that's what a lot of the guidance documents are going to get into, is how do you do a toxicity study to the level that the FDA will say it meets the CFR, it meets this adequacy standard to be deemed reliable, to be deemed suitable for this purpose. And so that's what we'll see in the guidance documents as well. Our final criteria is a toxicity threshold, which is listed as a safety factor, and here we're actually getting a specific standard to say for all products, no matter what type of product it is, that it cannot be approved with a tolerance of 1/100th of the maximum amount demonstrated to harm animals in experiments. And so we see an objective standard now that when we go to do these studies, that not only does the study methods have to be adequate, but the study results have to show a toxicity that doesn't violate this safety factor. And so we have not a lot of information from the CFR and from the statute. We have some general definitions of safety, something that tells us about the adequacy of our methods, and something that tells us about a maximum threshold for toxicity. And so, as so often is the case, we're going to turn to the guidance documents, and there's several guidance documents. There's at least 8 guidance documents that we'll talk about, and we'll switch over. We'll do one case study real quick in the slides, and then we'll switch over to the FDA's website, and we'll look at all of the guidance documents that are available, and then we'll click and we'll see some of them. We'll look at the Red Book on toxicity, and we'll look at a few others and get a sense of what those are. And some of them are going to be specific to a particular product. You may need to use it, some you may not need to use it. The toxicity is probably the most generally applied, environmental studies as well. So we'll get into those. We'll start with a case study. I think it's always interesting to take this from the abstract of thinking about safety and thinking about added and trying to figure out in a current example what we think of those ideas both as a consumer, something I like to emphasize, and also as a regulatory professional. As we learn these concepts and we apply them to these case studies, does it make sense? And so we probably have been following this little bit of debate that we're having with the Aqua Advantage genetically modified organisms. They've genetically modified salmon. They've provided, they're injecting the salmon with two genes, that one that helps with growth and another that does another benefit. And they've sought FDA approval, but they're not seeking FDA approval as a food additive, but as an animal drug. And as one can imagine, GMOs is a very sensitive topic among consumer groups, among consumers, and we can get into comparative law discussions about how Europe and Japan and Canada and some other countries treat GMOs and how the U.S. treats GMOs as a comparison. But here it's very interesting that they sought approval as an animal drug, being the idea being that salmon as an animal subject to Center for Veterinary Medicine being injected with these rDNA, these genes, the gene sequences, that is a form of animal drug and therefore needs CVM approval, but is not necessarily a food additive, even though these are animals intended for human consumption. So very, very contentious subject. For our purposes, we can look at this and ask some very rudimentary questions. We always start with that beginning slide and we say, is it a food? We can look at the salmon and say, well, its intended use is to be grown and harvested as human food, as a meat source for humans. So yeah, it's a food, potentially, right? And then we can look at it and say, well, are the gene sequences that are being injected into the salmon that we could or could not qualify as food, are those added substances? Are those food additives in particular? And all of this is going to be, I debated whether to put it in our reading, but I'm going to put it in our reading. There's a petition that some consumer groups are putting together and submitted to the FDA to say this needs to go through the food additive process. This is not appropriate for an animal drug review. And they go through this analysis. They talk about it being added, food additives, and so on. And the interesting question that we get to in the food additive component is, okay, if we say that the salmon, if we look at salmon as a food rather than looking at the gene sequences that become incorporated into the salmon, if we look at it in that basis and we say, well, now we're talking about a salmon that has different properties than another species, say, we'll call it a GMO species of salmon for this argument. Is that a food additive? And you may be looking and saying, well, what about the generally recognized as safe exemption? Salmon surely has a common history of use as food prior to January 1st, 1958. And the consumer groups raise that argument and say salmon, natural salmon that is not genetically modified has been consumed prior to January 1st, 1958, but salmon that is a mixture of these different genotypes has not been consumed. And so we have this question of GRAS or food additive, but we always focus on the added substance, so we always look at what we're adding to the particular food. So here we can even go further and say, well, people have not been eating rDNA, gene sequences, as an isolate, so maybe that's a better question to look at. And so if we go through that analysis and we say, okay, salmon is a food, the rDNA, the gene sequence we're adding, is an added substance and a food additive under the definition in 201S, then is it safe? And so we've just gone through this analysis very briefly, and we'll jump into the guidance documents after this slide. And we have the general definition of safe, we have toxicity threshold, we have studies, and I think that would be the question that what most people would point to is, has the makers of the Aqua Advantage salmon demonstrated through methods that the FDA would deem adequate that the genetically modified fish is as safe under general standards and other standards to be consumed. And so that's a valid question, and maybe it is appropriate for it to go through that analysis in addition to going through the Center for Veterinary Medicine. And so I want to carry that discussion into the discussion board. I think it's a fun one to have. It's a great one we can have debate at each of these points and make these actually really relevant about defining food, about defining additive and food additives and safety. And so we'll carry that over. But what we'll do next is we'll transition into the guidance documents on the FDA webpage and get a sense of what those look like, and that may color our sense of whether or not this particular case study should go through the that rigorous of a review. All right, so we're continuing our discussion of the approval criteria by looking at guidance documents and getting a sense of where these are, what they require, and more of the information about what they talk about. And we'll begin by looking at a familiar guidance document, the Q&A about the petition process for food additives. And this one we read and getting a sense of just the general petitioning requirements. And here in Part F, we see the shortened list of guidance documents and how to prepare your petition. And actually, we can click on any of these, and they'll take us to the longer list of scientific guidance documents. And these are the guidance documents that will help us with a number of areas, from color additives. We have some that are specific for that, for food packaging, for food contact notifications. So not just specific to food additive petitions, but to other areas like food contact, which is an indirect food additive petition, and color additives, which is its own amendment. And so we see a lot of these that are focused on specific areas that will be part of the substantive review: chemistry, toxology, and environmental. But we also see a microbiology document, and that's something that we didn't see in our substantive review, but that is something here. And I think the biggest one to look at is the toxology principles for safety assessment, and this is, again, specific to both food additives and color additives, and that'll be something we can talk about in the comparison. There have been previous drafts, and you may have known about these drafts or see these drafts out there, but be careful to know that they have been superseded. So we had what was called Red Book 1, Red Book 2, and now we're in Red Book 2000. You can see its history here, when it was issued and when it was last revised. So we can take a look at what Red Book 2000 looks like and gain a sense of what kind of studies will be required. And so here we see that we have some general guidelines for conducting toxicity studies, again meeting that adequacy standard, reporting the results, pathology considerations, statistical considerations, and then we get into some of the specific toxicity studies that may or may not be necessary for our substance, and we have to make a determination with our food additive petition team to determine which ones we need. Looking at short-term, subchronic, chronic studies, all of those being considered, neurotoxicity, just a ton of studies that we can look at, all animal studies that we're looking at. But it is good to gain a sense just by looking at the general guidelines for conducting toxicity studies, good laboratory practices, test animals, the number of animals we need. All of these things come into play, and so it's very specific about what we're doing. And so it's very good to spend time when considering looking at a substance and determining whether or not you need a food additive petition, to begin to gain a sense of what that food additive petition would look like, and to gain a sense of what it's going to be in terms of the time involved to get it done. If we look at the introduction, the FDA provides a little bit more information about the guidance documents and the criteria that it's going to be looking for and why it's doing this particular study analysis, to let you know that it is about meeting an adequacy standard. So there are environmental guidance documents, and we haven't talked too much, but there is an exclusion for an environmental assessment, and when testing is necessary, when it's allowed to do an exemption. And so that's available, as well as the environmental assessment. Once you actually determine that you need to conduct one, you can look at the guidance document that talks to that end. And remember, this is something new, 1993-94, that we're having to conduct. Estimating dietary intake, which we've seen is so important to all of our food additive petitions. We have to make sure that we're looking at what level will be consumed in addition to its intended use. And so there's a whole lot of information here about sources of data, modeling, types of intake, chronic, acute, all of these things. And we're looking for the safety standard not only to be non-toxic in eating it once, but if the cumulative exposure from that, the chronic exposure from that as well. And so how do we measure how much intake will be over that period of time? All of that information is going to be here with lots of examples to look at. And so this is important. And again, you'll see that these guidance documents sometimes will be combining color additive components as well. So you need to be careful when reading these to make sure you're applying the right criteria. So we have other scientific, other chemistry guidance documents that are specific to food additives. And even here we see that this is going to be helpful in looking at Gross notices if we're relying on scientific procedures. And then we have antimicrobial food additives and micro considerations for food additive submissions. And so this is looking at something specific, and that's why we haven't seen it in our substantive review. But pesticide chemical use and is a form of food additive. So we have to be careful about that and what we're antifungal, antimicrobial substances. So we have a number of ways that we're bringing in different entities. Here we're bringing in even the EPA with the FIFRA regulation and looking at EPA regulations into the FDA. So these guidance documents cover a lot of ground, a lot of agencies, and we haven't even looked at EFSIS, which would have additional guidance documents for meat, poultry as defined. Remember, going back to our discussion in the introduction class, how we define meat and poultry, making sure that those are considerations. And remembering that the FDA has primary control, and that's why we'll see the majority of the guidance documents coming from the FDA. But there may be some additional considerations from physicists. So this is our overview, and you can see that there are a number of guidance documents. If we just take a tally of non-specific, one specific to food additive, there's about 8 guidance documents to look at, and probably the most substantive being the Red Book that has quite a bit of information. So this is where we can find them. This is where we will need to look and do our planning and gain a better sense of how our studies will meet that adequacy standard, how they have to prove and report the results that meet that safety standard. And so it's a good overview to understand how that approval process is going to look at. So we'll switch over now to the discussion board and continue our thoughts on the GMO salmon. And we'll pick up next week with looking at color additives.